All right, we need to move quickly through the next three councils, but we move quickly not because they are not important. We continue to deal with the issue of the person of Jesus Christ. The Council of Nicaea certainly clarified that Jesus is of the same substance as God. But then the next councils have to deal with the question of how is it that Jesus can be truly God and truly human. Whereas Nicaea dealt with Christ's divinity, they also dealt with the Trinitarian issue, the relationship of the Father and the Son. And so often historians refer to the Council of Nicaea as a Trinitarian issue. But later attention turned to the relationship of Jesus' divinity and humanity. And part of the problem here is the conflict between the Greek understanding of God and the incarnation of God. Their understanding of God is that God is perfect, He is abstract, He is distant. And Greek terminology for God included terms like immutable, impassible, transcendent, impersonal, meaning that he cannot change, he cannot suffer. He is totally other and separate from humanity. Okay, the incarnation of God then is a conflict with that. How can God change? How can God suffer? How can He be God with us? How can He be personal? And so Christology then is the issue of the second, third, and fourth councils. So let's look at the background to the second council. After Nicaea, the conflict between Orthodoxy and Arianism continued. And as I said, it was a political issue, depending on who could influence the emperor. Okay, but the other theological issue was this question that, in a sense, we grapple with today. If Christ were very God, how could He be true man? Okay, do we accept this as a paradox? It is a biblical paradox, but nonetheless it is a paradox. And so they were wrestling with this. And so we come to the bishop of Laodicea is Apollinarius. Sometimes his name is Apollinarius. Okay, so you'll see it both ways. But he was Orthodox. During the Council of Nicaea, he was an opponent of Arianism, and he asserted the unity of the Godhead, the humanity of Christ, and the full deity of Christ. He was a friend of Athanasius, and by the time that we come to this question, he's quite elderly. But as he tried to understand the relationship of Christ's humanity with His divinity, he taught that Christ had a human body, but not a human soul or a human intellect. Instead, He was possessed by the divine Logos. So this is kind of a crude drawing of what this might look like as a human body, but instead of a human mind, he's just the divine Logos embodies His intellect. Okay? Now, this sounds good. He's human. He's divine. But what's wrong with this?
The resurrection is what's wrong with it.
Okay, the resurrection is one thing. What do you mean, Ronald?
Well, if this is true, then after the resurrection, Jesus did not leave. Jesus came from the grave. He ascended in a human body.
Mm-hmm.
And at some point, he doesn't get rid of that body.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Dispose of it. So that's what I mean by the resurrection.
Okay. So he doesn't have a complete human body. He's not completely human. So he's neither human nor divine. Apollinarius has concocted a tertium quid, a third reality. And so in this, whereas Arius taught that Jesus was not fully God, Apollinarius is teaching that Jesus is not fully human. Okay, and as Ronald says, his bodily resurrection affirms that Jesus was fully human. So, enter the Cappadocian Fathers. This is a term we use for three very important men who live in Cappadocia, which is the northern part of Asia Minor, or what is now Turkey. We'll talk more about these three men later, but they are Basil the Great, his brother Gregory of Nyssa, and their friend Gregory of Nazianzus. Okay, so it's kind of confusing that we have two Gregories, but nonetheless, these two are brothers. This is their friend, but the three of them together interacted with each other, and they were responsible for the orthodoxy of this time. They taught that Jesus must be fully human. They taught that Jesus took up humanity so that humankind could be saved, and only if he became truly human did he save us. This is an important statement made by Gregory of Nazianzus. If any believe in Jesus Christ as a human being without human reason, they are the ones devoid of reason and unworthy of salvation. For that which he has not taken up, he has not saved. All right? This is important to the central argument that they had. If Jesus did not take up a human intellect, then we cannot be fully saved. Our intellect cannot be redeemed. He saved that which he joined to his divinity. If only half of Adam had fallen, then it would be possible for Christ to take up and save only half. But if the entire human nature fell, all of it must be united to the Word in order to be saved as a whole. Okay? Does everybody understand the argument of the Cappadocian Fathers? Okay? Do you understand the failure of Apollinarius' understanding about the person of Jesus? All right, so again, the emperor gets involved. Theodosius I, a very significant emperor, very powerful Roman emperor. He is the one who in 380 declared that Christianity is the official religion of the Roman Empire. And he's the one who actually declared pagan religions to be illegal, and he authorized persecution against them, and quite a role reversal. But nonetheless, Theodosius was very much involved with the church, and and so he called the Council of Constantinople. At the council, Apollinarius was condemned as a heretic. However, he was not exiled as Arius was, because at this time he was 70 years old, and he'd served the church for years, so they didn't exile him, but they did excommunicate him, and they prohibited him from worshiping in the Catholic Church. The Council of Constantinople reaffirmed Nicene orthodoxy and condemned Arianism. So once and for all, in the East, Arianism was condemned, and this we don't have an issue with Arianism in the East anymore. And they did affirm the divinity of the Holy Spirit. the Cappadocian Fathers took up the cause of defending the divinity of the Holy Spirit. And so that was a byproduct of the Council of Constantinople. And they issued what we call the Nicene Creed. Okay? Why do we call this the Nicene Creed if it was composed at Constantinople? It's because Nicene is a lot easier to say than Constantinopolitan. Okay? All right. I had to practice that for years in order to say it. So we recite the Nicene Creed, but we still recite this in many churches. Those that are liturgical or those that want to join themselves to the universal church will recite the Nicene Creed. And see the expanded statement about the Holy Spirit. And then also it has a statement about the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, one baptism for the remission of sins, and the resurrection of the dead, and the life of the world to come. So a much fuller statement beyond just Christology, also pneumatology and ecclesiology. All right. Well, so that was 381. So we have relative peace, theologically speaking, for 50 years. But we're approaching another theological conflict that has some political overtones as well. And here we have to understand what's going on in Christendom at this time. The Council of Constantinople, of course, meeting in Constantinople, had an affinity for that great city and that great church. And we've discussed before that at the Council of Nicaea, that there were 4 archbishoprics. That is, there were 4 dioceses that were placed above all the others. And those cities that were honored were Rome, Antioch, Alexandria, and Jerusalem. Okay? Now, by 325, Jerusalem was not a major center of Christianity. However, Jerusalem had a great deal of symbolic importance as the birthplace of Christianity. And so they included Jerusalem in this position of honor because of tradition. However, at the Council of Constantinople, Jerusalem was removed from its position in the top 4, and it was replaced by Constantinople, okay? Which certainly makes more sense in terms of significance, because by now it's the capital of the Roman Empire. It is the seat of a large church, a large body of Christians. And so Constantinople takes its place in the top 4. In fact, in the East, it has more prestige even than the dioceses of Antioch and Alexandria. And so the bishops and the clergy of Antioch and Alexandria competed with each other to see who would place the archbishop in the church at Constantinople as the patriarch. And so we have political competition between these two churches. All right, not only political, but theological conflicts, because we have different emphases in these two churches. In Alexandria, they emphasize the divinity of Jesus and minimize his humanity. In Antioch, it's quite the different. They emphasize Jesus' humanity and minimize his divinity. What happens when you emphasize one over the other? you fall, yes, you fall over. You fall into heresy. You must keep these in balance. And so these two theological persuasions have tendencies toward heresy when they don't maintain their balance. Not only their understanding of Christ, but their understanding of Scripture was involved. Because in Alexandria, they had their great spokesmen were Clement of Alexandria and Origen. And what was their very interesting tendency in interpreting Scripture? Allegorical. So they would spiritualize the Scripture. In Antioch, they were more literal in their understanding. Theodore of Mopsuestia is a great example of a literal interpreter from Antioch. So they have theological conflict between these two churches as well as political. All right, Nestorius in 431 was the bishop of Constantinople. He came from Antioch. And so he's going to be opposed by the bishop of Alexandria. And he just opened himself up for attack because he preached against what was the very popular title of Mary, which is Theotokos. Theotokos, which means bearer of God. He considered this concept to be Apollinarianism, because it seemed to him that if Mary was actually the bearer of God without reference to his humanity, then he was not fully human. And so he opposed this title and preferred Christotokos, the bearer of Christ, which is actually technically more accurate, okay, because it acknowledges that Mary gave birth to the Christ. We all can agree with that. And Christ has more of a concept of fully human, fully God, rather than the bearer of God, which emphasizes Jesus' divinity. Okay? Now, for us, this again may seem like splitting hairs, but the fact is that he was concerned about the veneration of Mary. Was this a genuine concern? Was this a legitimate concern? Well, yes, it was, because the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church today use the term Theotokos as part of their veneration of Mary. Well, in opposing the term Theotokos, Nestorius wrote some very sloppy theology. Either he was a heretic or he was a sloppy theologian who didn't communicate very well, okay? Which means we've got to be really careful when we are communicating theology. But his teaching seemed to imply that Christ had two natures and two persons, both human and divine. One was born of Mary and the other was not. So he was saying that Jesus was two persons, that Mary gave birth to the human Jesus, but that the spiritual Christ then came upon Jesus, so that the two of them together were Jesus Christ, God and man. So he was emphasizing Jesus' two natures, but to such an extent that it seemed as if he were teaching two persons. Is that correct? Is Jesus two persons? Remember what Tertullian said, one person, two natures. Okay, so Cyril, Bishop of Alexandria, pounced. He was hostile to Nestorius, and he was just waiting for his opportunity to attack him. And so when he read about Nestorius's opposition to Theotokos, when he read his theology that seemed to imply two persons. He wrote 12 anathemas against Nestorius and called a synod in Alexandria and condemned him. And then Cyril was able to convince Emperor Theodosius, this is Theodosius II, the son of Theodosius I. He convinced Theodosius II to convene a council at Ephesus. Theodosius II, by the way, had been the one to appoint Nestorius, but nonetheless, he was swayed by Cyril to convene a council to try Nestorius. Well, the council just went wrong from the very beginning. Nestorius was supported by John, the Bishop of Antioch, obviously, since Nestorius came from Antioch. But John was delayed, and so he was not there at the time for the council. Cyril went ahead and convened the council. He took advantage of John's absence, and with the support of the Alexandrians and the Western bishops, he convened the council, condemned Nestorius, and had him deposed. Okay? Well, then John of Antioch and the other bishops from the Antioch area, they arrived. When they saw that Cyril had already convened a council, they convened another council, and they restored Nestorius, and they condemned Cyril.
Baptist business meeting.
There we go. Baptist business meeting, all right, where we have some deacons meeting over here and other deacons meeting over there. Well, Theodosius was like, this is not turning out well. We are not having any unity because now both of these bishops are deposed. And then he thought, you know what? Maybe it's just as well. We'll get rid of both of these guys and start all over again. But Cyril of Alexandria had the resources of the church to bribe Theodosius. And so Cyril was reinstated, and yet Nestorius still found himself in a position of being deposed. So finally, Theodosius brought Cyril and John together, and both parties accepted the theological statement, one person, two natures. Theotokos became the standard title for Mary, so the Antiochenes yielded on that idea, and then John of Antioch agreed to the deposition of Nestorius. So Nestorius was deposed. Well, when Nestorius was deposed, he went back to Syria. He wasn't able to be a part of the church in Antioch, and so he and some of his followers moved to the east of Antioch and established what they called the Church of the East. Historians refer to this as the Nestorian Church. And the Nestorian Church lasted for centuries and in fact became very evangelistic, using Syria as a base of operations and traveling along the trade routes into India and into China. And if you look on Blackboard, under Unit 3, you'll find there's some pictures and stories there that I've posted about Nestorian Christianity in China. In 635, several Nestorian Christians arrived in Xi'an, which at that time was the capital of China. They spoke to the emperor and shared the gospel with him. Now, he was not converted, but he did admit that Christianity is an enlightened religion. And he allowed these Nestorians to build a monastery not far from Xi'an, close to the Taoist temple that is there. They built a monastery, and adjacent to it they built a pagoda after the ancient Chinese architecture. 100 years later, the emperor of the 8th century decided that all foreign religions should be banished from China. And so he had all Christian churches and monasteries destroyed, including this one that this original Nestorian Christians had built. But he didn't have the pagoda destroyed, and it is there today. And back in 2006, when I was visiting China with my sister, who has lived there for over 20 years, Lynn took me out to this pagoda, and I've been inside it, and I've seen there's a fresco of the Nativity that is inside. And anyway, on Blackboard you can see a picture of the pagoda and my sister. And also, at the time, shortly after the arrival of these Christians, someone told their story, carved it into a stone monolith, which they call a stela, S-T-E-L-E, a stela, and this has been preserved. In fact, it was after the expulsion of Christians, it was buried, and it was discovered in the 1500s when the Jesuit missionaries arrived. And when this was discovered, the Jesuits were able to say, look, Christianity was here 900 years ago, and here's the story. And so I've seen the Nestorian stela as it is. Let's see. Then in 2011, I went back to see Lin again, and we traveled to the northwest of China to Dunhuang, which is a very arid region. And there's a whole series of caves. And most of these caves were the sites of worship of Buddha, but there were a couple of caves where they found some Christian artifacts, either brought by Nestorian Christians or inspired by Nestorian Christians. There's a bronze cross brooch that was found there and is displayed in a museum. Also, there's some pages of the Syriac Psalms, and of course, from Syria, they would have read the scriptures in Syriac. Anyway, I just say all this to say that Nestorius and his followers continued to do church and to do missions, and that's just some extra bonus features that are available to you on Blackboard if you want to look. Okay. Here we go. I forgot that there was a map here of the Nestorian Church, or the Church of the East, starting here, and you can see traveling all the way into China, and probably here marks Xi'an. All right. The next, oh yes, Matthew?
So going back to the one we just did, the Theodicus is what they went with, which is bearer of God. You said bearer of Christ is probably more accurate, yet Nestorius is the one that is kicked out. So in your opinion, was he really a heretic?
Yeah, thank you for asking. Well, now, of course, between the terms Theodicus and Christodicus, yes, I prefer Christodicus because Theodicus leads to the veneration of Mary, and certainly it has. We see that in the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, Mary is venerated and placed up, really right up there with the Trinity. Okay. But what do I think of Nestorius' theology? I appreciate your asking that, because I do want to clarify that we really don't have anything from we have very little, I should say, from Nestorius' original writings. Most of what we have is embedded in Cyril's anathemas, but we do have a treatise written by Nestorius after the Council of Ephesus, after his deposition, and this has the title of the Bazaar of Heraclides. And in this treatise, he actually clarifies his theology, and it is fairly clear that he was orthodox in believing that Jesus was one person with two natures. However, we don't know if he wrote the Bazaar trying to backtrack on what he said, or if indeed it simply was a clarification of what he had intended all along. But most historians, looking back at what we can infer that Nestorius taught, he probably was an Orthodox theologian but he was a sloppy writer. And we're going to find out that at the conclusion of the Council of Chalcedon, that he's going to agree entirely with what Chalcedon said, and he felt that Chalcedon vindicated his theology and actually condemned Cyril's theology. Okay. So my opinion is that Nestorius was not a heretic, but he was a sloppy writer, but the good thing that came out of the Council of Ephesus is that we can affirm that Jesus is one person. Yes, Richard?
So, I mean, really the Lord ended up using the Nestorius church, who was ultimately potentially orthodox in their doctrine based upon Nestorius' writings, and used them to do some better missionary work than the Catholic Church was doing at the time.
That's true. Certainly did. They certainly did some great mission work. So yeah, you're right. I think God works all things together for good, and even in these councils, and even through these emperors, we may decry the union of church and state, but we can be thankful and amazed that in spite of being determined by politicians, they actually turned out well. Okay, and we're really going to see God's hand working through the process of Chalcedon, because before we get to Chalcedon, we've got quite a bit of background to cover. The Alexandrian situation is that Cyril was succeeded by Dioscorus, the new bishop of Alexandria. And Alexandrian theology is being championed by Eutyches, who is a monk living in Constantinople, but he is the recognized spokesperson for Alexandrian theology, emphasizing the divinity of Jesus. In Antioch, Flavian is now the bishop of Constantinople. He is from Antioch, but he is the bishop of Constantinople. And in Rome, we're now starting to see Rome getting involved in these Eastern controversies. Up until now, most of the Western bishops had very little to do with these Eastern conflicts. But in Rome, Leo, the bishop of Rome, was very well respected, and he was trying to extend his influence throughout Christendom. We'll talk more about Leo when we get into the fourth unit. All right, Eutyches taught on behalf of the Alexandrians that Christ was of the same substance as the Father, but not of the same substance as humanity. Instead, he taught that his flesh was not human, it was heavenly flesh. He said Christ was initially of two natures, but the human nature was overwhelmed by the divine like a drop of honey in the ocean. Okay? So Eutyches is teaching one nature of Christ, that being the divine nature. So at a synod at Constantinople, the Flavian, the Patriarch of Constantinople, condemned Eutyches, concluded Christ is of the same substance as humanity. He had two natures which are united, and again he allowed Theotokos. But Dioscorus in Alexandria engineered another council, again meeting at Ephesus, using his relationship with Theodosius II, called a council. And at this council in Ephesus, 449, please don't confuse it with the Council of Ephesus in 431, he condemned Flavian and the Antiochene position and restored Eutyches, declared two natures heretical. Okay, the idea that Christ has two natures was declared a heresy by Dioscorus. And even though both Dioscorus and Flavian had asked Leo to communicate on the topic, when Dioscorus read what Leo had to say, he refused to allow this letter to be read. Flavian was beaten. He was beaten so badly at this council that a few days later he died from his wounds. Now you may think that you've been to a bad church business meeting, okay? But probably not as bad as this synod. Leo was so angry that he referred to this council as the robbers' synod, and it is not recognized today. Okay? But notice that here we have Emperor Theodosius II getting involved, and we have a negative conclusion to this council. But we see the intervention of God. When Theodosius died, he was thrown off of his horse, and he died. His sister Pulcheria became the empress, and she called a new council because she was not in favor of the Alexandrian position. So at this council, Leo's letter was read aloud. We call this Leo's tome. Evidently, it was a very long letter. And the decision was this: Christ is perfect in deity and humanity. Christ is of the same substance as the Father and humanity. Christ is one person with two natures. Christ was born of the Virgin Mary, Theotokos, and it reaffirmed the first three councils and Tertullian's Christological formula. Okay? So Tertullian, writing in 200, that Christ was one person and two natures. Finally, in the East, they recognize the wisdom of his formula and admit it. Okay, so ultimately, the Council of Chalcedon then makes an orthodox statement about the nature of Christ. All right, the implications are that the statement made by Chalcedon became the standard Christology for the majority of Christians. It vindicated Nestorius' theology of two natures, if not carried to the extreme of two persons. All right, but it did condemn the Alexandrian position that Jesus has one nature. So you see why Nestorius would feel himself vindicated. However, he heard about the decision, and he died shortly thereafter. So he never was able really to be readmitted into the church. Condemned the one nature of the Alexandrians. Now, because his letter was involved in this decision, Leo felt like this confirmed his primacy of the Bishop of Rome over other bishoprics. The bishops in the East said, well, thank you very much for your help, but no, we're not going to submit to you. But nonetheless, this was an important part of the rise of the importance of the Bishop of Rome. Again, we'll talk about that in a couple of weeks. The Chalcedonian definition is what came out of this. We call the Chalcedonian statement the Chalcedonian definition. Now, what is a definition? It's something that tells you the meaning of a word. But when you think of what definition comes from, this word fine is Latin for the end. And so a definition actually is a boundary. And so the Chalcedonian definition says that it is a mystery about the person of Jesus Christ. And the Chalcedonian definition didn't explain the mystery, but it did define the boundaries of the discussion. Okay? And those boundaries we'll discuss in just a minute. All right? Here's the Chalcedonian definition. I'm not going to read it. Let me just summarize it. Okay? The Chalcedonian definition actually summarizes all of the councils in one statement. Against Arius, it affirms that Jesus is fully God. Against Apollinarius, it affirms that Jesus is fully human. Against Nestorianism, Jesus is one person, and against Eutyches, Jesus has two natures. So the definition is this: Jesus is one person, two natures, fully God, fully human. And we can discuss the person of Jesus Christ, but we must discuss it within those boundaries. If we emphasize one against the other, if we define his person as two persons, or as we overemphasize his divinity, or overemphasize his humanity, we're going to fall into heresy. But this is the Orthodox Christology. And after all these councils, after all these decades and centuries, ultimately the Church has come to an understanding of who Jesus is. Any questions? Comments? Now, if Bart Ehrman were here, what would he say about the Church and its Christology?
It wasn't original to the New Testament writings.
It wasn't original. The Church really didn't come up with this until 451. Okay? Is that a legitimate complaint against Christology? Or is it that it took the Church this long to fully comprehend who Jesus always has been? Okay, we have to understand that this is rather complex theology. So it took the Church a long time to comprehend fully who Jesus is, but that does not mean that Jesus has not always been as he is. Okay, so that is where Bart Ehrman falls into error, but unfortunately, it's for those who are not familiar with the development of historical theology. His complaint, his accusation, is all too easy to accept. Okay, that's why it's important for us to understand these councils and the development of our Christological thought. We recognize that it is a development of our Christology, but it does not mean that it is a development of who Christ is. Yes, David?
Wouldn't it be the same thing to say that people believe that the world is flat until somebody came along and said, no, it's not, science has proven it's not. But that doesn't mean that the world wasn't round until someone discovered that.
Right.
And the same thing here is just because we couldn't figure out, okay, Jesus is this until 451, we had debated until we kind of hashed it out. Didn't mean that the Christ in the New Testament wasn't the same way.
Right. I like that. I like that that comparison. Okay. Anything else?
Question, kind of comment.
Sure.
Dr. Putman once told me, none of these guys woke up one day and said, hey, I want to be a heretic. And just trying to wrestle with what were they trying to reconcile within their own understanding, or maybe that's the answer to the question. What what in their context, what in their personal life, what in their religious context was leading them to try and find an answer to these questions that then led them to these extremes. That's a loaded question, and I don't have time to talk through it, but I've always wondered that. Why push those bounds, particularly when they're gathered in these settings where other bishops come in and try and apply corrective measures, they refuse them. So I'm just curious.
Okay, it's a good question and a very accurate observation about these men whom we now call heretics, because they were very sincere men in leadership positions of the church. Apollinarius certainly had devoted his life to the church and to orthodoxy, okay? And it was his sincere attempt at understanding how Christ can be both God and man that led him to this idea that he was not fully human, but that he was possessed by the divine Logos. So this was he was making a sincere attempt to understand the person of Christ, but he fell into error by going into an extreme. Okay, and so we had to have others come along and clarify what true Christology is. So you're right, and I would say the same thing about Nestorius and Eutyches, that they were simply trying to understand the person of Jesus. And there is a sense in which heresy serves the church by forcing the church to clarify orthodox theology, biblical theology. Without the heretics pushing the boundaries, then we fail to come up with the correct definition. So certainly the church needs those who push those boundaries for us. But I appreciate you bringing that up, because we don't need to think of these heretics as enemies of the church, but we do want to think of their inaccurate, their errors as dangerous. Okay, we need to understand their heresies as dangerous.
It's almost ironic that these men who are trying to delineate sound doctrine, trying to pursue doctrine, very much Titus 2:1, that's for you, sound doctrine. These are the men who wind up in the doctrinal ditch, as it were. It's just, there's an irony there that I can't quite get my finger on.
Right. Okay. Yes, Richard?
I'd just say for some of them, I mean, it's just like what you see in modern day. The Pentecostals came about and started doing all this, stuff, and so other people went to the other extreme and was like, they started speaking in tongues and going crazy, doing certain things, and then the Baptists for a long time was like, we're not doing anything. We're just going to sit here and nobody's clapping or anything. You start trying to address extremes, and then you go to extremes to try and prevent somebody from falling into those extremes. You go to extremes yourself.
Right. Yeah, very good. All right. Yes, when you get into theological conflicts, you tend to push each other into extreme corners. Okay, when really you need to find balance. Okay? I think a great example of that is Arius and Alexander, because there's one story that all of this developed because Alexander was teaching his clergy about the nature of Christ, and he seemed to communicate modalism. He emphasized the unity of the Godhead to the expense of the distinctions among the persons. And so Arius, being critical of that, then pushed back to show the distinctions between the Father and the Son, but then he went to an extreme to say that not only was the Son distinct, but he was subordinate. All right, so we need to be careful in conflicts that we don't push each other to extremes.